think of stories as points of connection. So like stories are the way that we connect with God, with his world, with one another. And stories convey meaning. So stories shape the way we move in God's world. And we can see this at like a microcosm sort of level where an individual will have certain stories as a part of their day-to-day mode. And those stories will either chain them to lies or they'll bind them to freedom. And then also at a macrocosmic level where people throughout human history have used stories as a way to connect themselves with the world that God has made. And even if they don't know God in this direct way, they still use stories to make sense of things and to draw out meaning in the world.
Hello and welcome back to The Commonplace. My name is Autumn Kern, and whenever I start a podcast like that, it means that I am not alone. I am joined today by a very special guest, my friend Emelie. Emelie, will you say hello to the Commonplace listeners?
Hey, Commonplace. Good to be here.
I'm so happy to have you here. So Emelie and I have known each other for a bit now. She was one of my early cohorts for what was Patreon back then, but is now the Common House. And so I feel like I've been able to engage in these ideas with you for a bit, but I don't know if you remember, it may not have been your very first comment, but it's what I always remember. One of your first comments in Patreon was you disagreed with something that I said in the podcast, but you used Pilgrim's Progress to defend yourself. Do you remember this?
I do remember this, yes.
And as soon as I read it, I just knew, I was like, oh, I like this woman. Like, I just need to know more about what she thinks. And thankfully, we've continued this conversation, all these ideas in classical education and in story particularly. So whenever Emelie leaves a comment, I just want everyone to know it's always so wise and insightful and beautiful. And it adds a new layer or it clarifies my thinking. And particularly when it's about story, no one comments in Common House about story the way Emelie does. So as I was thinking about what sort of angle could I add in this whole season about classical education, I know that story is the one that for a lot of moms, we're like, yes, easy sell. Read great stories with my kids. I know we need great stories. But when we actually get into it, we start to have these questions like, what do I do with magic? How do I explain what's real? What do I do if my child just constantly says, I don't want to play this. I don't want to read this. None of this is true. How do I think about form? All of a sudden, there are a lot of questions about literature that we didn't know we needed to ask. And so I brought Emelie here because this is her thing. And I'm so excited to just unleash her in conversation to share these lovely thoughts. And so to kick us off, Emelie, if you will tell us a little bit about you and your family and then how you came in through the classical wardrobe.
Yeah, absolutely. So I live in South Georgia with my husband and my 4 kids. They range in age from 6 down to 9 months. And a very formative part of my story was that I was in the Navy for 6 years. So straight out of college, I commissioned as a nuclear surface warfare officer, and I served on ships. And then I went and I learned how to run the Navy's nuclear power plants on aircraft carriers. And I bring this up because it was while I was in the Navy that I fell through the classical wardrobe. So as you can imagine, the nuclear training was pretty vigorous. And like probably a lot of y'all, I was schooled in kind of this normal mode, which is really test heavy. And I did a lot of very successful cramming, brain dumping. And so I got to this high profile job where I needed to really not only learn and score well on tests, but then retain that knowledge and be able to use it. And I had a bit of a crisis because I felt like I struggled to really know things at this deep level. And it was right around that time that I read The Benedict Option by Rod Dreher. And in that book, Dreher has a chapter about classical education, kind of specifically distinguishing it from a lot of modern secular or Christian schools. And so the light bulb went off. I started to pull the string. And then I soon found out about the liberal arts tradition and these deep ways to know things, to apprehend truth. And so that just totally sparked my imagination. I've been learning about classical education ever since. And that brings me to today, where I'm at my house with my 4 kids, classically educating, and really loving it.
I love that. Your background story is the most wild for any mother teacher that I know. No one else can drop that they were in the Navy doing nuclear things. And yet I love that because I do think one part of story, and I think this is partly because of like the Mason Instagram world, a lot of times it seems like it's just literature in a Mason education, when actually a child should care with the breadth of God's world, like all of the things that he's made. And so I love that, because math and what we would think modern science, the way we would use the word science, all of these things also declare the glory of God and also help us to know him and become like him. And so I just love that you were doing nuclear things while you were reading, and then you found the tradition, and it fits so perfectly with this whole view of a person and of living and everything. So I'm so glad you got to share that. Okay, so on to story. Can we start with why stories are important?
Yes, absolutely. I like to think of stories as points of connection. So like stories are the way that we connect with God, with his world, with one another. And stories convey meaning. So stories shape the way we move in God's world. And we can see this at like a microcosm sort of level, where an individual will have certain stories as a part of their day-to-day mode, and those stories will either chain them to lives or they'll bind them to freedom. And then also at a macrocosmic level, where people throughout human history have used stories as a way to connect themselves with the world that God has made. And even if they don't know God in this direct way, they still use stories to make sense of things and to draw out meaning in the world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one thing that I've really found interesting in coming into the classical world is this shift from being rational brain oriented people to actually being heart oriented. Like, we're lovers and we chase the idea of the good life, which we usually tell to ourselves in story. And so the stories that we build out, particularly for our children in the early years, but even the ones we tell ourselves, both that we read and then we actually tell ourselves about the life we're leading, are incredibly formative in the direction that we move. And of course, that comes out of our fingertips, like you said, into how we practically move in God's world. So I love that idea of connection. And we know, of course, the science of relations about finding those connections, and story is such a unique way to do that. Mason particularly recommends a number of types of stories for young kids. And it's kind of a very broad span when you think usually about like children's books, and that's just it for kids. And Mason comes in and she gives these heavy hitters. She's like, kids need the Bible straight up. They need myths. They need fairy tale. Can you explain a little bit why she thinks this is so important, and maybe how these work together? Because it could feel like to a mom, this could be confusing if I read the Bible, but then I read a myth, and then I read a fairy tale. How will my kids know what's heads or tails?
Yeah, I think they all build off of one another really beautifully. And so we, like as Christian homes, we start and we're reading the Bible all the way through. But then once you start to introduce myth and you start to introduce fairy tale, the world starts to expand, and our ideas of what's possible in the world start to expand in really, really profound ways. And as you're encountering these larger than life stories, you slowly start to realize that so much of the Bible is larger than life. So much of God and his plan is far beyond anything that we could imagine. And so just that those things revolving around one another and getting deeper and deeper into story helps you get deeper into scripture and helps you get deeper into just God's world that he's laid out for us, and to understand the plot of redemption, of salvation so much more fully.
Yeah. No, I think that's really wonderful. It's one of the reasons why I love Narnia so much, is that I think it brings that meta narrative into such clear view in a way. I mean, even Lewis says, like, you see Aslan here, so you can learn to see him in your world. It's just a little bit more clear. And I just know that Aslan has always pulled on my heartstrings so much and making me long for Christ. Like that idea of scripture being put into story that way. Or even today we were talking to our kids about how all good stories are based off of this story. Like they all echo the story, the themes in scripture. So I think when parents then start to go looking in these categories, we have a couple of ditches. So in the classical world, we can assume that just because something is old, it means it's good. In the Mason world, we get really scared by this idea of twaddle. And so we go around looking for book lists that we can follow, and this rule, and can someone help me perfectly figure out what not to do, rather than learning to love the real thing, the good story. So I'm wondering if you can kind of break down for us, what is the form of a good story? What is it that's attractive, that's beautiful, that speaks to the soul?
Yeah, I'll start with what a story is, because I think that can be even like helpful to weed it out at this fundamental level. So a story, I like to think of it anytime you have a person in a world interacting with that world. So we often describe that as character, setting, plot. But that's what a story is. And then a good story is one that inspires us, moves us, delights us. And so you have Paul in 1 Corinthians, I think it's chapter 10, verse 23, where he talks about all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. And so all stories are fair game. Our God is the Word. So anything that's conveyed in this medium of words, he's involved in it in some way, even if it's so remote that it just seems like that's the foil for his plan. It's the opposite, but there you can really find Christ in most anything if you look and you dig deep enough. But then once you start to appreciate the impact that stories can have on your soul, then you start to want to really imbibe good ones, to only go looking for the best. And I've been thinking a lot lately about the Holy Spirit and the role of the soul as we encounter stories. And an inspiring story has been something that's been on my mind a lot as we think about like the vision of the good life and how we move in the world. It's only when we're inspired that we're going to act in one way or another. And so we want those things that are inspiring us to be good, to be beautiful, to be true. And it's just the nature of our fallen world that some things are more that than others. And so I think story operates on this soul plane where we're putting our own life on hold and we're entering into something that's deeper, that's affecting the way we feel, the way we move. And so all of that comes into play when we step into a library with our kids and they're showing us this or that. And I think another thing that's been helpful as I encounter this choice or that choice in the library, I like to think of, does it exist to entertain or does it exist to engage? Because in our modern sphere, there's a ton of content that's out there that seems like it's just meant to make money and just to sell books, and it's kind of riffing off of something else that maybe it to begin with was creative. And we can kind of feel that out in our own families and with our own ways of encountering those things. But there's something to be said for a really beautifully creative, deep work of art. And so picking up a book and even asking, like, is this operating on that plane, or is it operating on more of the entertainment, something you'll spend your time and not get a lot of return for?
It sounds so much like Mason, like nothing happens without a living idea. Like you're using an inspiring idea, but like you can't even habit train without first some sort of inspiring living idea that has to catch the attention and the desire to act. I think that's really great. I want to ask you, kind of getting down a little into the muddled weeds as it happens, when you are trying to, it is easy sometimes, I think, to find the good seed in something. Like I know this trips me up sometimes. There are the obvious categories of things where I'm like, this is either just completely empty, it's actually twaddle, or this is harmful, this is not happening. But then I can get into things like Disney, where I can see the threads of fairy tale. I could, if I tried, bring out gospel themes in certain characters or certain behaviors and actions that happen. But overall, I think the form is a little too cartoonish. And so I think about Mason's idea of aesthetics and beauty and making sure that things are lovely when they're presented. What do you do in those kind of murky waters? Because I think that is where I've seen, at least within Common House conversations and messages that I've received through the Commonplace, that's where people get stuck, where it's like, well, I could see this character lay down their life for someone. I could really push that, but they have this music. And I know this is actually a comment you made recently that I would love for you to talk about with Disney, is that it's musical, so they're sharing story in the music mainly. How do you kind of weed through that? Do you have any sort of just any sort of like counsel or wisdom for someone trying to move through this for the first time?
Yeah, I like to think about where the story is pointing. I think that the Disney stories particularly, they take these classic fairy tales they're working on this mode of symbol and these mythical aspects, and then they have like this modern spin on it. And oftentimes that modern spin is pointing towards the self, like pointing towards the character and their own desires. And so oftentimes, depending on what the story is, I'll steer clear of it just because it's really, rather than a story that's pointing towards something greater, it's something transcendent, which we know down the line that's Christ, like that transcendence, it's pointing towards self-fulfillment or whatever else that may be. And it's not yeah, it's not inspiring us in the way that we want to go. And yeah, the comment about music and Disney, my daughter, every single time we went to a library, wants to check out the Disney books. And I do not want to read the Disney books in my house because they just, especially I think about them as compared to the movies themselves. So this is how I explain it to her. I'm like, this is not the original form of this art. This is something else. And so much of the art of a Disney film is in the music. Like, it is a musical. And so you're telling the story with these songs, with this action, and the book that we're holding in our hands right now is just a really simplified, dumbed down version of that doesn't really move you as you read it. And so I will read the books in the library. We just won't bring them into our house because I want our house to be a place where only the good sorts of stories that we're kind of discussing exist. So not all Disney movies will let you down, but there are definitely some.
Yes, that's true. And I think even that is a really helpful point, when the danger of drawing the twaddle lines or trying to figure out what is the do not do list is that you lose the need to learn to be wise and to actually assess and discern. If you can just be like, we just don't do this at all, then you actually could possibly miss something good. Like you're saying, not all are going to deliver the same thing. I think that's really good. We have a similar rule when we come across books like that at library sales or things where you can get them for 50 cents, that they can be a car book for a short time and then they'll just disappear. That's the rule, but they don't come in the house. And so I know that one thing you call yourself as a home librarian, and you have been kind to lend from the Thomas Library to the Kern family. It is something that we have in common, where we want to collect and pass on the books that need to be shared, even if they're hard to find, if we're going to spend a lot of work to do it. Could you share a couple of your principles for building your home library? Because I know you've put a lot of thought into this.
Yeah. I love to fill my library with beautiful books. And so any and all books that are on the shelves, illustrations, because I love picture books really specifically. So the illustrations. Yes. Yeah. I have like this whole huge curated library of picture books in all kinds of different categories too. And so one of the things I love doing with the kids at our meal times is just pulling one out, reading through it together. And so, yeah, I usually kind of look for like the words being poetic or being rich, and then the illustrations being good. But I have all kinds of books about, like, my nuclear background, sciencey topics, and that like educate us about things in this huge spectrum. But for all of them, they're worth the while. They're really going to add something to our life, whatever that might be, and they're going to give us things to think about and things to chew on for a while.
Yeah. Emelie really is the picture book queen. So I have interviewed Emelie before, but it was uniquely a Patreon Common House perk. And it was about this thing she created called the liturgy binder. Because when a lot of people come in through the wardrobe, they start to realize that your repeated actions, your practices, pull on your heart. They aim you towards a certain telos, a certain end. And so moms start thinking, like, what can I do in my home to have these embodied living ideas? And Emelie let me know about this thing she created called Liturgy Binder. And so that resource still exists in Common House. But whenever we hit any sort of liturgical season and people are asking for picture books, Emelie always has the list. It is actually one of your gifts in life. You have a picture book for any time of year, anything. And I love it. I am not a picture book queen. I like them, but I just spend more time on different books. And so I'm always so grateful to get your list right around like Advent, right before Theophany. Like I can kind of go through your list really quickly and get some new books from us for the library. Okay, so I think one category for moms that can be a little bit tricky is the idea of fairy tales, the use of enchantment and magic in story. And I think that, like you were saying earlier, you were entering into another world. You are being shown rather than told certain things about reality, and it's pointing you in a direction. And I like to use the language of it lifts the veil a little bit. So we live in this immaterial reality, and story allows us to kind of break through that a little bit. But moms have concerns, they have questions about the magic and the enchantment. And so I would love if you could kind of speak to why this is so important for the imagination. And particularly in our modern way, we often think that you can just catechize moral instruction, you can just teach rules. But really, in the classical tradition, we would say it's more about garnering affections and training appetites. So if you could kind of speak to how enchantment helps form that in a child.
Yeah. So I think we can even see this in ourselves when we're encountering a story. It's moving us. We like really care about the character. We want them to succeed. We want the evil to fail. And so story already is putting us in this plane where we're dealing with things that are shaping us, that are forming us. And then with the magic coming in, magic is something otherworldly. It's something that, especially in our modern mind, we think like we don't encounter that on a day-to-day basis. Like that's not measurable. What do we do with that? But the more I just trying to be open to wonder, trying to be open to like the grandeur of God's world. Magic, it's a really small and otherworldly way to describe the grandeur of God and to describe the miraculous, the sacramental. And God does so much in our world that we can't explain and that we can't measure. And so, and when we look for reality to only be measurable, to only be something that we can see and we can point to, then God Himself, who we can't see and we can't point to in the way that Thomas could when he stuck his finger in Jesus' side, becomes inscrutable. And so magic really, like you said, it lifts the veil. It gives us this opening to entertain worlds and possibilities that are bigger than us and that transcend reality and break through.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's so important in actually accepting the unseeable parts of God's reality around us. I have been using the idea of magic as almost operates like grace. I've had some pushback on that, but the idea that it brings order from chaos, it makes things lovely and beautiful, it heals things, and it works in a way that we can't see, but often through seemingly ordinary means. Like Chesterton has this thing. I think it's Chesterton, although you would probably know if it was Tolkien because I know you know him. But where he talks about how a wee bit about how that there's still natural law in a fairy tale. So like magic would never make 2 + 2 = 5, but you could actually understand like a tree that bears magical fruit, for a maiden who's in need or something like that. And so there's still like a law to the magic in proper enchantment and fairy tale, which I thought was really helpful because of course there are plenty of things you wouldn't want to bring into your home that would fall under the category of magic in a bookstore. But in this particular way, this classic fairy tale way, I do think it helps a child grow comfortable with that reality that they can't see. I don't have any facts on this. I just have like kind of a gut guess that the reason why across traditions there's a mass exodus from the church when children grow up and leave the home and go to school is because we've trained them and catechized them in schools to only trust what they can measure with their 5 senses. And yet the Christian faith asks for something very different. Have you thought about this?
Yeah. So Tolkien talks about also the children, and Walter Longren Jr. also does a really good job of kind of spelling this out, where the child, especially when they're young and they're at this place in their life where they're closer to God in certain ways, like they know that evil is real. Like magic isn't all good. There is black magic. There is darkness in our world too. And I always think about Tolkien's quote where children know that dragons are real. And so having a dragon in the story, having the magic in the story actually helps the world make more sense to them, because they are not at the stage where they're adults yet. They don't feel like they control everything in their world, or that they can. And so they're not struggling with the same things we are. And especially in stories where the good triumphs over the evil, like they inherently, because we're made in God's image, they know that that's the way reality should go. And so it almost like strengthens their trust, and it strengthens their faith and their ability to look to their father's story and see that same thing play out.
Oh yeah, I have goosebumps because they do. They absolutely believe that good will triumph. It has to. Like that is the way it goes. It's like it's etched into our souls. It's part of being an image bearer. You need to know that there is a St. George. I know Lewis has that whole thing about real stories. I'm sure you've read this one as well, where I believe he uses women's magazines as his example, but we could use Instagram or the news cycle or anything, that how often people are actually confused by what is considered a quote real story. But in a fairy tale world, nothing is confusing. Like, what is right and you know what is wrong. You think you're just telling a lovely classic fairy tale, but actually you're dealing with epistemology and morality and theology. But it's very clear vice is grotesque and virtue sparkles. You're not kind of muddled the way we can be in our real stories. But this concept of real is something you've talked about in Common House, and I would love to hear you talk about it a bit more, because we have often the question, what do I do with a quote realist child? The child who says, well, dragons aren't real. Well, that's not real. You can't go to another world through a wardrobe. How do you speak to your children about these things? Because I know you use the language of incarnation, and I would just love to have you explain to us how you engage with young children when you have questions like this.
Yeah, one thing I kind of like, first we'll put the child back on their own feet. Like, when you say real, what do you mean? To have them really think about that. Like, what is reality? Or truth, where like something isn't true. Well, like what do you mean by that? Because I've found that oftentimes children are not asking the question of like, oh, can I go find this in my backyard, or will I encounter this in my day-to-day life? They're asking a deeper question. They're asking this question of, can I trust this story? Can I open myself up to this story, and can I let it change me and affect me? Or do I need to put this story in a box? And so often the way we talk about stories, like, oh, this part's real, this is not real, it totally cuts us off from the work that story is designed to do on us and in us. And so, like I mentioned before, I think of stories as having their own world. And there are things that happen in this world. And if the story is good and it's true, then there's a lot of parallels between what happens in the world of the story and then what happens in our world. And there is this transcendence that exists there, where the story is able to open up all of these apertures for truth. And then when it comes to whether or not the story is true, especially like stories like St. George and the Dragon, is it true? Well, it's truer than true. It's pointing to this great truth, to God's truth. And so I use that truer than true language a lot with my kids, especially after having laid that groundwork of what are we talking about when we talk about reality. And the story itself is not something that you can put your fingers on. Like, it's in this book. It doesn't come into your world until you read it or until you hear it. And so it's already more intangible. And I think that like kind of understanding that, I wouldn't express that specifically to my kids, but understanding that as somebody who is encountering stories in my own right and with little ones, like knowing that that the story is different and in a lot of ways greater than just our own experience. I think Lewis talks about how he, I don't think it's Newton. Yeah, Newton. He's able to see so much farther and accomplish so much because he's standing on the back of all these giants. Like, story like books themselves, they're a technology, and they allow us to spread things beyond ourselves even. So I love thinking about sort of the like nitty gritty stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's great. I stole the truer than true from you. Like you left that
in
a
so
comment.
Glad you did.
Perfect way to do that. I mean, it's come out in Commonplace content, so it's all there. The realer than real, truer than true. But I got that kind of. I use it almost like a hook or a peg, so that when I get these questions, I can like latch onto it and then keep going. Like, it kind of gets my mind working in that direction. And I think even if, like you said, a mom isn't going to necessarily use that full explanation with a young child, I think actually moms don't understand how to think about this. Like, oh, okay, yeah, Narnia isn't, I'm just use Narnia again. Narnia isn't real, but I see that it's saying real things. But like, just hearing that and being like, now I understand it. So then depending on the child, being able to engage, hopefully, and build out that conversation, I think will be really helpful. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that so I think about Mason here too, where she has her metaphor of the feast, and the children are coming to the feast, and they're going to take from it what they need. And so when we're reading stories with our kids, there's probably something in the back of our mind as a mom where we're like, you need to take this away. But like, if we as moms could just keep our mouth shut and let the story do its work on our children, that's a really beautiful thing too, because they're able to take from it what they need, and it's often not what we expect. So I think of that, and just also in talking about if something's real or if we can encounter it in our world or not. If the child isn't asking, like not even going there, and then if they go to that plane, then pointing them like beyond towards the incarnation, towards Christ. And then there's one more thing that I have to share with Common House. So I heard from Hans Boersma. I don't know if you've general audience member is familiar with him, but he's a theologian, and he wrote a book called Heavenly Participation. And he is like the voice on sacramental, larger than life, God breaking through to our day-to-day reality, Christianity. And somebody asked him one time, how do I impart this vision of the world, this sacramental God existing in all things? How do I impart that to my kids? And he said, no, don't use the word just. And he means don't say, oh, it's just a frog, it's just the sky, it's just this or that, because nothing is just itself. It's always connected to Christ. It's always pointing to him in its very being what it is. And so that has been a huge peg for me that I have carried with me. I'm a grouch about it when I hear my husband say just, he knows. He's like, oh, sorry.
sorry about that. That is so good. I have his book behind my head. I know exactly where it is because it's on my to-read list this year, the Heavenly Participation book. That's a fantastic answer. I love that. It actually, so I would love for my kids to see the world like Gerard Manley Hopkins did. I would love to see the world like Gerard Manley Hopkins. So we memorized his poetry together because I just want that to be shaping out when we're in the woods and when they're looking at things, that this is the verbiage they have, the language they have. Oh, please go. Tell me more.
Yes, this reminds me. I took a class last January with Christine Perrin, and the class was all about poetry and the Psalms and the imagination. And one of my huge takeaways from this class, as we encountered this, actually my first exposure to Hopkins was in her class. And
he's my favorite poet.
He's wonderful. Yeah.
He's so good. Yeah.
Like the imagination piece really came through as like a major point of mission for Christians, for parents, for Christian parents. The more we're able to strengthen the imagination of our children and build out their imagination, the more, the stronger their faith will be and the stronger their relationship with God. And so this is like one of the things that fairy tales do indispensably. Like there is nothing that will strengthen and expand your imagination and your wonder like a fairy tale. And the more we read fairy tales as a family, the more we encounter them in our own right, we're just that much more familiar with the plot of God's story. And we have it driven home to us again and again, these truths in a way that really moves our hearts. And so wanted to put that in there as well.
No, I'm so glad you did. It actually is like perfect into the next thing I wanted to ask you, because you and I both really love liturgical living in the home, like the embodiment of ideas. And one thing about just the use of the imagination, I always think about it around the time of Advent and Christmastide. So like we are entering into the season of preparation and then festivity. And it seems to be the easiest part of the calendar for people to kind of get going on, right? Like we have enough to kind of start knowing how to bring this into the home. And yet a lot of times in the Christian world, I hear a lot of emphasis on, Mom, you don't have to do anything extra this Christmas season. Like it's kind of a thing that really gets me each year starting in November, because I think about how we are building out the imagination of a child during all of the year, but particularly this unique time of year. Like you have these unique times compared to ordinary times so that you can bring the fullness of things in. But I always think about the ability to bring in all five senses, to change the home, to change the sounds, to change the books, to act out the story as it is, and what that does to cement the allegiance of a child to understand what's actually going on. And if we think about like the moral and mythic imaginations, those are the metaphors that children use to understand what's happening in their life. It helps that their narration to themselves about their life. And I just think that we have such a chance as moms to build out that imagination in the home. And so I really want to talk to you a little bit about embodiment and learning, and particularly through literature, because having lovely thoughts is only like one part of what we're trying to do. We're not just trying to give them these ideas. We do want them to actually act lovely in God's world. And so it's necessary that our thoughts and our loves and our actions are all working in this harmonious way. And so can you kind of break down how we can live out story in our homes, whether that be the overarching church calendar, like liturgical year, or just the stories that we love? How can we bring those into the rhythms of our home?
Yeah, I think, Autumn, you do a fantastic job of actually bringing like stories themselves into the home. There was this one point when Autumn dressed up as Narnia and had a battle with another family. And I was like, that is a different level. That's amazing. And
I love Narnia, Emelie.
I love how much you love Narnia. It's made me love it more. And my incarnating stories does not go to that level, but the church year and the liturgical calendar, which you brought up, is so rich and so deep. And so there's kind of these two categories of that. There's the temporal calendar, which is where we follow the life of Christ in any given season and cycle. And then there's the sanctoral calendar. And I think both of them are really helpful. So the temporal calendar, when you live into that, you have this chance to embody and really put yourself in the middle of the action with Christ as he's born. As you prepare for his birth in Advent, he's born as he walks through the Passion during Holy Week, especially if you're doing that in a church setting, where you're really going and you're gathering with community. And my favorite example of this is Maundy Thursday services, where there's a foot washing, and you get to hear the story of the Last Supper, and you get to then take off your shoes and your socks and walk up and feel the humility and feel the discomfort that comes with getting your feet washed. And it really does form us in deep ways, and it connects us to our church body. It connects us then hopefully to our community as we go out, and we're just that much more inspired to move in God's world after the example of his son. And so, yeah, the temporal calendar is so rich, and it continues to just be new every single year and every season, and speak into the lives of everybody in the home. And then the sanctoral calendar is the calendar of the saints. And so you've got the different feast days that commemorate people who've lived in and followed God in various places and times. And I think that this is also a really important piece of encountering stories of the faith, especially because when you start to, I don't know very many saints, but I learn about them as I see their names on the calendar, like, who is this person? What have they done? And we'll look those stories up and kind of just dwell on them as a family. And you start to get this idea of how many different types of people God has sent out to do his work, and how different that work looks depending on the person and their context and their call. And so all of this, I like to think of the sanctoral calendar as like each day you have this like beautiful shard of glass, and when you combine them, you see an image of Christ, the incarnation, in this stained glass window, and you see how many different ways there are that Christ has sent out his hands and his feet, and like this big full picture that helps you equip you then as a follower to seek after him and to be a part of that window and to be a part of that story.
Yeah, no, I agree. For a mom who just heard that and thinks, wow, that's amazing, how do I start? Beyond me telling them that I do have your liturgy binder mini-sewed in Common House, what would you recommend a starting place to be for a mom who is totally new to bringing this into the home?
Yeah, the way I started was I bought a couple volumes of Stories of the Saints. I kind of like did my little Emelie book filter. I'm like, this is good quality stuff, good illustrations. I can read this enjoyably, and it looks like it's really gonna shape our family in good ways. And I started to just not every single page of the book, but just I would open it every once in a while, and we would read about people, and we would just share their stories. I have this rotating on the note of like embodying story and kind of having it really shape your life. I assigned at one point each of the days of the week to a different type of story or poetry at our breakfast table. And so reading a saint story was just, I think, on, what was it? I've got my little chart up there. It was myth, mystic, Monday, like monastic, all of that. So like we would either read a myth or we would read about a saint. And so that's just part of our
monastic rhythm. Myth Monday.
I love alliteration.
That's great.
So yeah, they're all alliterated.
You just screamed mother teacher so hard. Yep. That's awesome. I love that. No, I think that's so great. I mean, I was just joking the other day that I can turn anything into a beautiful printable. So like, I'm just happy to make any sort of chart for the week, anything. Like I can fix my whole life with a pretty printable on the wall. Absolutely. No, I love that. And I love that it's so, one, I love that it is like an easy, practical takeaway step if you want to engage with these ideas, but also it's nascent. It's building out an atmosphere in your home of a repeated habit or practice of engaging with the ideas of something like the life of the saints or the church year, whatever it is. And we know that we are persons. And actually, if you are going to come along on this adventure through the wardrobe, you yourself are going to have to change. That is one of the biggest things that happen once you get on the other side is you realize, oh, I am not rightly ordered. What I want for my children is actually what's also best for me. And so I will need to change the course of our home in a couple of different ways here. Now, as we close out here, I would love to know, Emelie, what are some of your family's favorite stories?
We talked about Guardian enough. I'll skip over that one. We've been really into the Wing Feather Saga by Andrew Peterson lately.
Yeah.
We started listening to them on audiobook. It was my son was like really not into audiobooks. He was like 3 or 4 at the time, and he would scream when we put them on. But we put on this, and it stuck. And so we're actually kind of like re-listening to them now. And so I love the Rabbit Room and everything that they put out. Another favorite has been Caddy Woodlong by Carol Riri, I think that's how you say the middle name, Brink. And Caddy is a lot like the Little House books. She is, it's a true story. She lived in Wisconsin during the pioneer days. And when it was pitched to me, the person said, I like it better than Little House. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to read this. And I think I do too. Okay. It sparkles with like virtue and adventure. And it's like Caddy herself is such a quirky, but like delightful character. So I commend that to everybody. And then also near and dear to my heart on the fairy tale train is The Silver Trumpet by Owen Barfield. Actually, this is the book that I went to Autumn because it is so hard to find. It's out of print, but I think that if we spread the word, we can bring it back into print. We just have to find the right people that will produce this book. And so Barfield, for those that don't know, he was a friend of Lewis. And this is the one and only fairy tale that he wrote, but it's become a really, really fun part of our family culture.
Didn't you tell me that Lucy Barfield is the Lucy that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is dedicated to?
Yes, right? Yeah. So Barfield's daughter, Lewis was her godfather. Yeah.
Godfather, right? So. Yeah. That's awesome. No, the Silver Trumpet was wonderful. I was so scared to mail it back to you. I was like, what if it gets lost in the mail? Because this book is so hard to find, particularly a beautiful version of it. That's one particular hang up for me as I'm looking for used books, as I also want them to be beautifully bound. I do think there's a place called, I think it's Smigden Press, where you can put request in for them to bring books back. There's someone doing that, or maybe it's New Hope or New Roman Press, something like that. But I think you and I should hit them up, and we should try to get Barfield's trumpet, because it was wonderful. It was really, really good. I'm glad you mentioned that one. I wondered if it would come up. It was so good. Well, thank you so much for joining me to talk about story. Everyone else, I'm going to include in the episode notes today, which you can access just on the website or through your podcast app, places where you can read more of Emelie's work. A little bit about her bio. Hopefully we will be able to hear from her again, or maybe find that she now has an online home where she is putting out her lovely ideas. But otherwise, if you would like to hear more of Emelie, you can come find her in Common House. It feels weird to like pitch Common House for your resource, but it is your liturgy binder. So
I was like, where can people find me online? Common House. That's pretty much it.
I really do have this like, secret society of the most like just wise, intellectual, interesting, loving women, and they are sharing some really good ideas in there. It is another level. But we would love to have you join us. So anyways, Emelie, thank you again. This has been a delight. I'm so grateful you came on.
Yeah, so glad to be here, Autumn. Thank you.
And everyone else, see you in 2 weeks.